Hello everyone, my name is Jamisson O'Hara, and today I will be discussing international prison systems. In 2016, the Institute for Criminal Policy Research estimated that the global prison population had exceeded 10.3 million people for the first time in history. That is nearly a 20% increase since the year 2000. In fact, due to this escalation over the past couple of decades, this has now surpassed that of world population growth. Due to the ever-growing surge in incarceration rates, overpopulation has become present in prisons worldwide. Overpopulation within prison systems can lead to a decrease in living conditions and care for the prisoners. The Brennan Center for Justice estimated that of the 1.5 million Americans incarcerated in 2019, around 600,000 of them will be released at some point. That is nearly 95% rate per year. Living conditions, criminal justice systems, and rehabilitation programs vary from nation to nation, meaning that the prisoners within an American prison, a first world nation, will suffer different levels of adversity compared to those of a third world nation such as Maui. And last but not least, there is a direct correlation between incarceration rates and reentry rates, meaning high incarceration rates equal high reentry rates and vice versa. With all this being said, this begs the question, to what extent do adverse conditions presented by prisons in first world nations versus developing countries affect the inmates and the incarceration rates along with the rehabilitation programs implemented by a nation's criminal justice system? However, before we dive into my first perspective, there are a few confounding variables that must be addressed first. These variables are the development of a nation on a global scale, a national economy, and policies. These variables all help to mold a government, thus affecting a nation's criminal justice system. First up, I would like to talk about the impoverished nation of Maui. Maui is a developing nation in the heart of Africa that is constantly being bombarded under terrorist attacks. Elizabeth Van de Heide is an esteemed researcher at the Institution of Security and Global Affairs who is concerned with terrorism. Explains that due to the constant crisis, Mulanian government has opted for a more radical approach to rehabilitation, thus invoking radicalization. Radicalization is a process by which a group comes to adopt increasingly radical views in opposition to one's political views. This is mainly aimed at those in cooperation with the terrorist attacks in the hopes of reducing those rates. Lastly, Maui is considered one of the poorest nations in the world and was ranked 184th out of 198 in the world in 2019 by Human Development Index. On the other hand, the American government is faced with the highest incarceration and reentry rates worldwide. Michelle S. Phillips, a PhD candidate in sociology and social policy at Princeton University, explains that there has been a new punitive shift over the past 3 decades and that this is leading to a decline in rehabilitative ideal. Dating back to the 1970s, the United States attempted implementing a new form of rehabilitation that encompassed the mass alteration of inmates' service-related activities along with the programs presented by prison systems. All of these programs can be classified as either educational programs, psychological and counseling programs, communication-based treatment, or quality of life services. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, recidivism rates have decreased by nearly 20% since the programs have been implemented. Last but not least, first world nations such as the United States have financial resources needed to theorize, implement, and modify these programs as needed. As depicted by the chart on the screen, Elizabeth Van de Heide utilizes this chart to depict the age of involvement for convicted terrorists in Maui, showing that reform is needed on all levels of prison system, young and old. On the right of the screen is the percent of the prisoners awaiting trial in prison. Due to Maui's lack of financial resources, they are unable to address all sectors in their criminal justice system. Nelson Mandela wrote, in The Long Walk to Freedom, "Prison and the authorities conspire to rob each man of his dignity." Nelson Mandela also wrote, "Time slows down in prison. The days seem endless. The clinch of time passing slowly usually has to do with the idealness and inactivity. These quotes really stood out to me because Mandela uses them to depict how he and his fellow inmates were affected by the adverse trials that were enforced upon them during their sentence in South Africa. Mandela later then goes on to describe how the element of routine, a rehabilitation technique, helps for them to grow and better themselves, along with helping them to cling to something meaningful during their constant battle through adversity. Moving on to my next lens, inmates and prisoners. Depending on how severe the living conditions presented by the prison are, depends on the can correlate to the different levels of adversity that the prisoners are subjected to. Christopher Wildman, a vice provost for research at Cornell University, conducted an analysis and discovered that long-term restrictive housing can both physically and psychologically benefit inmates and lower incarceration rates. Incarceration consequences for the inmates vary throughout the nations, depending on what it is and how severe their crime is. These include solitary confinement, regular confinement, and punitive cell arrangement. And last but not least, the physical and mental effects from reform. These have a direct effect to the prisoners and the inmates who are subjected to them, and these affect how successful they are at re-entering society and re-entering life. If you direct your eyes to the chart on the screen, I stumbled across this chart a couple of times in several different papers. This chart displays the difference between conviction and employment. As determined by the graphs, the prisoners who were given treatment by punishment cell or other disciplinary actions saw a greater decrease in the overall rates of incarceration after being dismissed from their sentence. In conclusion, rehabilitation is needed for avoiding recidivism and decreasing incarceration rates. However, it is up to a nation's criminal justice system to establish programs that are more effective and feasible based on the situation. This also includes the goal of bettering living conditions for the inmates, along with giving them the proper treatment with the hopes of bettering them for when they re-enter society. However, with this conclusion, there are a few limitations and implications. The first limitation is that every nation is different, meaning tying back into the first world versus third world nation. Some rehabilitation techniques in the first world nation might not work as well in the third world nation. Next is funding. That also ties back into the poverty and the nation's development. Funding allows for the programs to be more effective and for the government to put more money into it and focusing on it. And then last but not least, multi-step process. Multi-step process means that it's basically, the future is always changing. The criminals are always evolving and incarceration rates will always increase, but this is the hope of getting it down. So tying into the multi-step process is just making sure that the process is able to be molded for the future. And then the implications of this. As being said, a nation's criminal justice system, they need to modify the programs based on what is needed for them, meaning that they need to narrow down the sectors in their criminal justice program and then focus on what needs to be focused on most, and then creating better living conditions. That just ties sort of on into making sure that funding is put to where funding needs to be, like as explained in the Maui thing, they need it in all sector levels, whereas in some nations they might only need it in 25 through 30. And then these are my sources.
Thank you. Panel? What evidence did you gather that you didn't include, and why did you choose not to use it?
So for me, we had another stimulus piece, and it was resilience amongst Haitians, which was what Lauren just did. I found stats pertaining to, they were very similar to the Maui stats of the people looking for a trial. They pertained to Haitians, and I thought it was another, Haiti, as Lauren said, is a very poor nation, very living in poverty, struggle, crisis. And so I just figured to go with Maui instead of Haitian, even though they had like approximately the same rates. I think it was 71% instead of the 93%.
How did you use the conclusions and questions of others to advance your own research?
Well, so going on through all these papers that I had sort of had conclusions in them. So I was sort of like intertwining them and finding like the narrow space and looking at the economics, the political, the actual impact, the future proof of it. So I was sort of intertwining and mending them together. And then I was talking to a fellow researcher, Trevor, about my research, and he's more stationed on the economic aspect. So that helped me to lean into the economic aspect of the government, and then thus giving me my first perspective.